metal cylinder, 5 feet tall, 3 feet wide, big enough for Edward II to stand in. His knees bent, spine arched, just enough room for him to breathe, but not much else. And in that cage, they paraded him around the streets of London, while the people watched, while the nobles pointed, while the clergy prayed. They dragged him to the Tower of London, deeper inside, to the place where kings once stayed, where Edward I had held court, where Anne Boleyn had waited. And then they locked him in, confined him to a single room. No bed, no chair, just a bucket for a toilet, bare stone walls. That was his new court. That was his new throne. But Edward was not one to bend, not one to break. The son of a tyrant, the grandson of a conqueror. He defiantly refused to die quietly. He wrote letters to his courtiers, to the Pope, to the French king, but mostly to his wife, Isabella. In one letter, he begged her to come to the Tower, okay? And there, face to face, he would explain everything. All those years of humiliation, of neglect, all those favors given to Despenser, all those rivalries, all those exiles, he would explain it all. Then she would relent. And then they would rule together again, as husband and wife, as king and queen. And that plan almost worked. Isabella arrived at the Tower. She came to negotiate, to discuss the future of England. But Edward, he did not let her in. He kept asking for more time, to explain, to persuade. But she was there for politics, not romance. And soon she left. But it wasn't over. Not even close. Sound, scratching at stone, faint whispers, had went on like this for 2 years. Edward survived. He paced his cage. He sang to stave off the darkness, but he was slowly fading, his body ravaged by sickness, by fear, by regret. Okay. And finally, in September 1327, he was too weak to write, too weak to beg, too weak to hope. On the 21st, he summoned his chaplains. They read him the last rites. Then he waited. For what? Death? Maybe. Or Isabella? Well, neither came. Instead, on September 25th, 1327, the door to his cell opened. There stood Hugh Despenser, the younger son of the man whose head had been cut off 2 years before. And he told the king, "Your Grace, you must come with me." Edward asked, "Where?" And Hugh replied, "To your grave." Soundscape, a single heartbeat, clear, echoing. They led him out of the tower, down twisting corridors, past silent sentries, into the darkness. Then they stopped, and Hugh said, "Here lies your end." He offered Edward a choice, a final choice. Either he would die on his feet, quote, by dagger, quickly, or he would die on his knees, slowly. And Edward, he chose to die on his feet. He stood up straight. He raised his head high, and then he was stabbed 3 times in the chest. And as he fell to his knees, he cried out, "Treason!" The last word of the second king of England to die violently, the first to die betrayed. And with that, Edward II was no more. And if you think that's the end of the story, then you'd be wrong, 'cause there's always more. Always. I have something to admit to you. It's that in another life, I was a king of England. But I don't remember how I got there. All I recall is a sprawling solar with high vaulted ceilings, sunlight filtering through stained glass. My knights clad in white, the queen beside me wearing white. Everything was white. Was it a dream? A hallucination? I don't know. I only remember vividly the end. My knights turning on me, the queen slashing at me with a knife, eyes blazing with fury. Then nothing. Darkness. I woke up in a dungeon, cold, hard stone scraping my cheek. What happened? Where was everyone? Had I been deposed? Was the queen behind it? These questions bounced in my head for days until I was summoned before Mortimer. He was a baron, a member of my council, a viper in silk and jewels. Now He stood before me, a triumphant smile twisting his face. "Your reign is over," he said, and I realized I was no longer a king. The next few days are a blur. I was paraded around, forced to watch while Mortimer took the throne, proclaimed himself regent. The barons hailed him. The people cheered. Then he turned to me, his smile turning cruel. "You will live," he said, "but not as a king. Your life is forfeit. Your dignity is forfeit. Your very self is forfeit." And I knew then that they didn't kill me right away, because that wasn't the point. They wanted me to feel my downfall, to live every hour knowing what was coming, what was going to happen, and that no one would stop it. They brought me to Berkeley Castle, a fortress deep in Gloucestershire, surrounded by shadowed hills, far from the court and far from mercy. They locked me in a cold stone chamber. No light, no attendants, no honor, only the stench of decay and the sound of rats scratching at the walls. I wasn't just imprisoned, I was unmade. No longer a king, no longer a husband, not even a father, just a problem to be solved. Then Mortimer and Isabella, my own wife, who sold me out, came to visit. They stood at the mouth of my dungeon, their silhouettes framed in the sliver of a doorway. I snarled, spat, cursed them. "What is this? What have you done?" Just making sure you're alive," Mortimer said, his voice dripping with false concern. "And why wouldn't I be?" I cried. "I have the blood of a king in my veins. I will reclaim my birthright. I will avenge this." "It's brave words," Mortimer said, his tone hardening. "But you won't. Goosey, we can't just murder you in daylight. That would mean blood on our hands. Regicide. Killing a king is a sin against God. It has to look like an accident, illness, or divine judgment. We need to erase you without leaving a mark, at least not a visible one." They went away then, leaving me in the dark, leaving me to rot. They made sure I was fed just enough to keep me alive. For months, I languished in the darkness, listening to the drip of water, watching spiders crawl across my skin. Some records say I grew sick. Others say I wept daily, asking for my son. But all agree my jailers were instructed to make me suffer, but leave no trace. They starved me, deprived me of sleep. They let my wounds fester. They let me rot. Yet I survived, day after day, week after week. A former king, Edward II, clinging to life in the dark. This persistence became a problem. And Mortimer grew impatient. He whispered to his assassins. He wanted the death to be final and unforgettable, so they came for me again. They dragged me out of my cell, shoved me onto a pallet, and carried me away. I struggled, I kicked, I screamed for help, but no one came. They threw me into a dark pit. I landed hard, wincing as pain shot through my body. Then I heard the scrape of a rope ladder. It's descending, footsteps on wood, voices hushed but cruel. "So the king has come to join us," one voice said, chuckling. "Indeed, your highness," another said. "Come to join us in hell." I screamed, but no one answered. The echo of my own terror answered. "Huh." Then came the most infamous method of all, a method whispered by monks, written in foreign letters, corded with a shudder in every historical text that dares to tell it. They brought forward an object, a hollow metal tube, polished, narrow, cooled with oil, and forced it between my legs, deep into my rectum. I thrashed. I wept, but it was held in place. Then they brought the second object, a red-hot poker, glowing from the forge, burning orange in the shadows. Without a word, they drove it through the tube. Sound, a single, shrill, metallic hiss, then a heartbeat, then silence. The heat traveled upward, burning tissue, searing nerves, cooking me from the inside. When they were done, I slumped to the floor, my vision blurred, my gut twisted into a burning knot. They left me there, gasping on the cold stone floor. a traitorous smile on their lips, and then they vanished. I don't remember how long I lived. Minutes, hours, days. All I recall is the unending torment, the searing pain, the feeling of being utterly, completely destroyed. Then oblivion. The next morning, the guards reported I was dead. Natural causes, they said. A lie whispered through centuries. A lie that history tried to bury. But truth has a way of surviving. Even in the medieval world, where violence was routine, where executions were public sport, my death was a horror story. Not just for its cruelty, but for what it meant. It meant that love, when misdirected by power, through softness, through sweetness, would be punished. That a king who ruled through desire, through softness, through deviation, must be burned out from within. Hello, and welcome to this house. Today, we are exploring the House of the Dragon and discussing whether or not King Edward II was burned alive. Now, before we begin, I have a question for you. What's the worst way to die? Is it a painful death? Is it a slow death? Or is it a death that's meant as a warning? Well, whatever your answer may be, rest assured, by the end of this video, you will agree that death is horrible. Edward II came to the throne of England in 1284 after the death of his father, Edward I. While his father was known as a great warrior and conqueror, Edward II preferred the finer things in life. You could say that he was a bit of a dandy. His peers teased him for his love of fine clothes and his obsession with jewelry. But Edward found solace in these things. After all, the trappings of power were a lonely burden to bear. On top of his rather effeminate nature, Edward was also irresistibly drawn to men. Now, while homosexuality was not illegal at the time, it was frowned upon. And because Edward was the king, he should have known better than to flaunt such scandalous behavior. But he couldn't help himself, and soon enough, his improprieties became common knowledge around the kingdom. For instance, there was the incident where he chained Hugh Despenser, the younger, to a chariot like a horse, and whipped him as he pulled him around. There was also the time he hosted a friend's birthday party and surprised him by carrying a torch to light the candles on his cake, only to end up setting the whole damn place on fire. Oh yeah. And then there was the infamous parading incident where the king paraded through London with his two favorite courtiers, dressed as hairy, wild men. The spectacle shocked the populace, and though some found it amusing, others complained bitterly. To make matters worse, Edward's wife, Queen Margaret, couldn't stand his shenanigans. In fact, she hated his guts. And after giving birth to their son, she spent most of her time away from him, preferring instead to live with her own parents. Eventually, Edward's mother, Eleanor, Queen of England and Ireland, stepped in and arranged for the couple to move into separate bedrooms. However, this did little to improve their marriage, as Margaret still refused to accept her husband's advances. So Edward looked elsewhere for love and affection, which, to be fair, is totally reasonable. And he found it in the arms of Piers Gaveston, Roger Mortimer, and Hugh Despenser the elder. Soon, however, the nobles had enough of Edward's behavior, and they started to meddle in the royal scandalous love life. The situation reached a boiling point when the barons forced Edward to choose between them and his favorite, Gaston. And he chose Gaston. This decision led to the First Barons' War, which ended with Edward having to flee to Normandy in disguise. But the king was eventually caught and taken back to London. To everyone's surprise, Edward agreed to give up Gaston and even banished him from the kingdom. But this didn't appease the nobles. In fact, they wanted more. They wanted the king dead. Now, let's return to our original question. What's the worst way to die? Well, if you ask Edward II, it would have been right about here. You see, the barons imprisoned Edward in his own palace and invited his wife and mother to watch as they murdered him. Now, exactly what happened next is up for debate. We have two accounts, both equally gruesome. The official report released to the public stated that Edward fell ill after a sudden and tragic decline in health. The king weakened by sorrow and grief over his banishment of Gaston, died a few months later on September 11, 1327. However, rumors quickly spread like wildfire that the king was actually burned alive in a small tower room above what is today known as the Jewel House. Apparently, the conspirators bound the king to a poker, shoved it into his mouth, and set it alight. Other versions of the story claim that Edward's flesh was seared off his bones, and that his heart beat for 3 full hours after they lit him on fire. Does anyone want to watch that movie after seeing this video? Yeah, me neither. Anyway, when his mother and wife arrived, they were greeted with the sight of a charred skeleton sitting upright in a chair. Now, to put an end to any rumors about foul play, the queen ordered that the remains be sewn up in a velvet bag and buried in the nearby church of St. Paul's. As for who ordered the hit, it's believed to be Roger Mortimer, who went on to rule England with Edward's young son as a figurehead, till he was caught and executed in 1330. And that's all we have for you today. Did you enjoy this video? Let us know in the comments section down below. Also, please remember to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. When you visit the ruins of medieval Gloucester Cathedral, you might stumble upon a quiet corner where an unmarked grave lies hidden beneath your feet. Some say the stone slab is too small to hold a king, but it does hold the bones of one King Edward II of England. His brutal death is legendary, allegedly cooked alive by red-hot poker. But the true story is rarely told, buried under layers of sensationalism and myth. So today, let's unearth it together. Edward II may not be remembered fondly, but he's certainly not forgotten, because in every whispered tale, every candlelit confession, there lived a single burning question. Was it worth it? Was love worth fire? Was softness worth the death so cruel it scarred a nation's memory? The medieval world didn't allow such questions. It taught obedience, taught power through war, dominance, and fear. A king had to crush. A king had to burn others, not be burned. But Edward chose another path. He chose affection. He chose loyalty, not to armies, but to companions. And in the eyes of his enemies, that made him dangerous, not weak, not foolish, but defiant. Isabella and Mortimer never spoke of the method, but the silence was its own confession. Wah, what kind of queen signs off on torture? Ka, what kind of mother allows her son's father to be reduced to ash from the inside? And what kind of empire watches and says nothing? K, England said nothing, and that silence grew teeth. It devoured truth. It reshaped the story into something more convenient, more palatable, more useful. Edward became a warning, not a tragedy, a lesson in what not to be. Don't be soft. Don't be gentle. Don't fall in love the wrong way or the right way. With the wrong people, don't lose control, because if you do, you won't just be removed, you'll be destroyed. Music shifts tense, mournful strings playing under the rain. And so Edward became the embodiment of the worst-case scenario, not for rebellion, not for tyranny, but for nonconformity. And while his death was denied, dismissed, doubted, it was never forgotten. Not really, because history has a way of turning silence into echoes. In 1594, more than 250 years after Edward's death, Christopher Marlowe wrote a play, Edward II. It shocked the audience, not because of the violence, but because of the love. Marlowe dared to show Edward and Gaveston as more than whispers in a court document. He gave them breath, he gave them pain, he gave them humanity, and by doing so, he forced the world to look again, to remember, to feel, sound. A page turns, a fire flickers low, casting long shadows. Today, historians still debate. Was the death by red-hot poker real or symbolic? Was it invented to shame or preserved because it was real? We'll likely never know. But we do know this: no story endures for 700 years without power, and Edward's story still burns. not because of how he ruled, but because of how he died. We know what the chronicles say. We know what the church denied. But what about the man, the boy who became king, the lover who became prey, the monarch who became a warning? He was not heroic, not in the way kings are remembered, but maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories survive not because of triumph, but because of pain. Soundscape fades to a near silence, so only a single heartbeat remains. Edward II's legacy is carved not in stone, but in fear, in shadows, in fire. And when you walk through Gloucester Cathedral, when you stand before his tomb, tucked quietly away, you can almost feel it, the weight, the shame, the scream that never left the room. Because even now, centuries later, people still look at that grave and whisper, did they really do that? As you explore further, you'll uncover more fascinating tales, like Edward III's unexpected journey to PJ, where royalty went to party, and Richard III's surprising connection to pizza. Plus, you'll gain exclusive access to our animated series, What If?, where we reimagine history's biggest moments through fun and educational cartoons. All this is waiting for you on our app or website. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. What they did to Edward II was not justice. It wasn't politics. It was a message. A message so violent, so intimate, so grotesque, that it still shivers through the bones of history. Because this wasn't about how a king ruled. It was about how he loved. And how an empire built on hierarchy, obedience, and masculine force spawned to a man who dared to be something else. Edward wasn't innocent. He made mistakes. He alienated his nobles. He elevated lovers into tyrants. He misread alliances, misjudged enemies, mismanaged war. But his worst sin, in the eyes of his time, he blurred the lines between king and lover, between ruler and companion, between man and weakness. When you take a crown, you are not supposed to bend. You are supposed to break. That was the old code. But Edward didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted to be understood. And in return, they gave him flames. But fire does not destroy memory. Sometimes it preserves it. And what remains of Edward is not just a name in a chronicle. It's a feeling, a tension, a mirror we are still afraid to look into. Because centuries later, his story still warns us. Not about rebellion, not about weakness, but about the price of being different in a world that demands you be the same. There are those who say the story of the red-hot poker was fabricated, a smear, a rumor weaponized by his enemies, and maybe it was. But ask yourself this, why did the world believe it so easily? Why did the chroniclers record it with such detail? Why did it echo for centuries in courts, in churches, and cathedrals? Because no matter how strange, how awful, how inhuman it sounded, it made sense to them. They believed a man like Edward could meet an end like that, and that belief is its own horror. Edward wasn't the first to court death. Kings play a dangerous game. Power attracts peril. But what makes this story timeless is not the throne or the tragedy, but the taboo. Love, sex, desire. Even today, we hesitate to ask, what if a king wanted to be loved? What if a monarch craved intimacy? How would an empire respond to a leader who chose connection over control, who picked a partner over a pawn? Edward may have been the first to try. He wasn't born broken. No one is innately weak. We are all molded by forces beyond our understanding. Consider this. How many men have been made weak by love? How many hearts have been turned cold by desire? How many souls have been imprisoned by fear of vulnerability? We are all products of a world that tells us weakness is shameful, that love is a liability, that intimacy is a threat. And in the end, that's Edward's crime. To have shown us all what it means to be truly afraid. To stand in the shadow of the past and confront what was done to Edward is to realize that humanity has not come so far After all, in the echoes of his agony, we hear a chilling message to all who dare to love. Do not misunderstand devotion. Do not mistake intimacy for weakness. Do not confuse passion with powerlessness. For love can turn a king to ash. I tell this story because history is not over. It's alive. It breathes. It feels. It bleeds. History is a conversation across the ages. And here, at the edge of the abyss, Edward is waiting to tell us something important. He wants us to understand that strength is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to embrace it. To be truly strong, you must first be truly vulnerable. And in that rawness lies the power to connect, to lead, to love. Long pause. Then, when you strip away the royal title, the court, the crown, the legacy, what's left? A man begging in the dark, burning from the inside out, screaming with no one to hear him. And the silence that followed was more permanent than any grave. Because England didn't just kill a king, it destroyed a voice, and that's why we tell this story. Here, in the shadows of forgotten thrones, are warnings we must not ignore. Histories they tried to bury, names they tried to erase, truths too disturbing for textbooks. Here at the channel, we dig deeper. We find the cracks in the foundation. Listen to the screams between the lines. We remember those who were forgotten, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. We bring you the darkest corners of human history, unfiltered, unflinching, unforgettable. New videos every week. True stories they never wanted told. Comment below. Who should we resurrect next? Because history isn't over. It sleeps, waiting to be heard again.